everybody, and welcome to today's Virtual Skills Lab. Just before we begin, I was wondering if people could please write in the chat box where you guys are listening in to us from. It helps me to make sure that everything is working okay. And if you can also write to all panelists and attendees, you'll see there's a little drop-down box so that everybody can see where you're from. I can already see that there's somebody from Belgium, from India, from Canada, all listening to us, all different time zones. Oh, wow. Chris from the Bahamas. I'm very jealous. The Netherlands, NYC, Dubai, the UK. Oh, it looks amazing, amazing. Okay, so welcome to today's Hult Virtual Skills Lab. This forum is an online global meeting space offering you the opportunity to skill up and get ahead from home. Connect with like-minded go-getters from all over the globe and hear from world-class Hult professors on the latest topics and trends in live interactive workshops and webinars. For those of you who are joining a Hult event for the first time, I just want to give you a little bit of background about us. Hult have designed a school that looks to the future by focusing on developing your leadership skills, challenging you with a future-oriented curriculum, and building a global perspective that only first-hand experience can bring. We currently offer an undergraduate program, 5 specialist master's programs, a global 1-year MBA, and a uniquely flexible executive MBA. More information on all our programs can be found at hult.edu. So today is the 1st of October. This marks the start of Black History Month in the UK. This important celebration began as a way of remembering people and events in the history of the African diaspora. It marks a highly significant milestone in the calendar. To recognise that, today we are joined by Hult Professor Bill Carney to explore the topic of the Black experience in the US, from Jim Crow to Black Lives Matter. Now, before we begin, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, a recording of this webinar will be sent out to everyone in the next few days. We would like to keep the conversation going and have it as a really interactive class. So please feel free to use the chat box if you have comments or want to ask any questions, but please make sure to all participants and attendees so everybody can see and have it as a running conversation. Professor Carney's masterclass will last approximately 45 minutes, including questions. So I would now like to hand over to Bill.
Thank you very much, Lizanne, and good evening, everybody. It's amazing to see all of the countries represented here. I mean, we've got India, the République du Congo, Jeanette from New York, UAE, somebody else from New York, Egypt, Mexico, Peru, another New York City, Bahamas. So welcome everyone. This is truly an international group and to a large extent a reflection of what your classmates are in many Hult classes. My name is Bill Carney. I've been a professor at Hult now, adjunct professor for 4 or 5 years. I taught both in Boston and nowadays mostly in Dubai. My area of research and expertise, if you will, I'm a marketing guy with a specialization, if you will, in consumer behavior. But that's really not what I'm here to talk about this evening. What I'm here and what I've been given the opportunity to chat with you about is one of my favorite topics, which is an aspect of Black history, right? I've been following my history, or our history, perhaps I should say, since I was a very young man, when I noticed already that any historical mention of Africa or Black people, for all intents and purposes, was missing from the curriculum of any of the schools that I had attended, and dove into the subject rather deeply, and have been down that rabbit hole ever since, doing research and participating in the movement, which I'll give you a little bit more background on later. I'm not going to talk very much about myself. If anybody's interested in Bill Carney, you can Google me. I'm relatively easy to find. I come up usually right on top. I'm coming to you from Geneva, Switzerland, which is where I'm currently based. And have been living for quite some time. So I have basically a Sierra Leonean nationality because my dad's from Sierra Leone. I have a Swiss nationality because I spent a lot of time here. And at heart and where I was born and grew up is I'm from New York City as well. I'm from 135th and Madison. I see some New Yorkers there, so I'll be a little more specific. So from Jim Crow to Black Lives Matter. I think I need to put things in context very, very quickly. So I'm trying to cover a whole lot of ground. So I'm going to be going relatively quickly. If any of you have any questions or whatever, bang them up in the chat, and I'll be more than happy. I have my chat open. I'll be more than happy to make sure that, even though I can't talk to you directly, that we can still have some form of interaction. Okay. While a lot of people tend to say that this whole issue of racism is an American problem, the truth of the matter is it is not an American problem. And if one really digs into the history, you'll discover that the roots of the problem are actually to be found in Europe, okay? And I know for a lot of my European friends, that might be a little bit of a wait a minute, what are you speaking about? Well, what happened was back in the 15th century, in 1455 to be precise, the Pope divided up what was then called the New World into two chunks. He gave part of it to the Portuguese, and he gave part of it to the Spanish. Now that's important, and I'll get back to that in just a second. The part that was given to the Portuguese was basically what, the Portuguese explorers had, quote unquote, discovered, which was the coast of West Africa, and to some extent, a little bit further down the coast, and even around the corner into Mozambique, okay? Around the Cape, into Mozambique. And in the declaration, what he did was he granted them tutelage on ownership of all of the lands that they would acquire there. And perhaps more importantly, in the Romanus Pontifex, as it was called, said that the people that they found could be held in perpetual servitude, okay? Those are the words literally from the Pope, perpetual servitude. In other words, forever and ever and ever. Now, the reason I mention this is that you have to recognize the impact of the Catholic Church and all of the other churches on Western civilization and Western society. In other words, this idea of Black people being inferior, and indeed in those days we weren't even considered to be people, is very deeply anchored, both in the religious, right, fundamental, if you will, of the society, as well as in the political structure, which I'll touch on just a little bit later, okay? Now, a few years later, the Spanish got into the business, seeing that there was money to be made in the traffic of Black people, which this traffic was just emerging. They passed what they called an asiento, which basically, now, when I jump back, the Pope gave Africa to the Portuguese, and he gave Latin America, or South America, to the Spanish. The Queen Isabella, right, you remember her in Columbus, she claimed that in the name of Spain. And then what she said was, because the native people, what they called the Indians in those days, because the native people were then Spanish, they could not be slaves. They could not be used for labor because actually they were Spanish citizens. And so therefore they created the asiento, which allowed the importation of Black labor, Black slaves, to do the labor that was required. Now, why was the labor required, and where was all of this coming from? Okay. All of this was coming from the rise of what we call the plantation economy, right? Europe needed or wanted sugar. Europe needed or wanted tobacco, and a number of other products that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. And in order to fill that market need, right, labor was required, okay? And as a result of that, and this is one of the reasons why this is perhaps an apt topic to be held within a business school, is that Black people became some of the most profitable chattel or merchandise ever. There were some 14 million Black people who were moved from Africa to either North or South America. And if you think historically what that means in terms of the numbers, and if you also think historically what that means in terms of the money that was made, often by the royal families. The Dutch were involved, the Danish were involved, the Portuguese were involved, the Spanish were involved, okay? Basically all of the Europeans, not all, but almost all of them got a piece of the pie, okay? So plantation life flourished in the Caribbean, in the United States, with Virginia, growing, and Massachusetts and whatever, in the early days, growing products that largely were sold and destined to be sold where? In Europe. So who's the ultimate beneficiary of a lot of this, of what's going on? In most cases, in many cases, European companies, okay? So the notion that there is no link is not true. There is a direct linkage, and I just wanted to establish that, okay? And a lot of that came in through the commercialization of the plantations and their need for markets, if I put it in purely business terms. As a result of that, particularly within the United States, as the slave trade grew, as black folks were imported to work on the plantations, we actually reached a point early in American history where there were actually more slaves than there were quote unquote free white people, and or European Americans, if you prefer that term. And Benjamin Franklin and others are on record, particularly Ben Franklin, saying, "Hey, wait a minute, we need to be careful here. We have too many black people in this country, and this could be problematic," because he was in favor of the separation of the races. Actually, Abraham Lincoln was in favor of separation of the races. Thomas Jefferson was in favor of separation of the races. And these are all people who were, either presidents or extremely important people in the foundation and creation of the United States. In other words, some of these ideas and ethics are very deeply rooted in the history of the country. And I think understanding a little bit of that historical context perhaps helps to understand a little better what's going on now. Let me leap forward in history, right? A big jump. And we come to the Civil War in the mid 1800s. What's going on there is that the southern part of the United States is very wealthy as a result of the tobacco and cotton and whatever, which is being largely powered, if you will, by slave labor. And you also have now the emergence of an industrial complex, which is emerging in the northern part of the country. And so you have the two sides of the country basically arguing for control over the United States. And this resulted in a civil war. Now, the Civil War was partially about slavery, but not really. Indeed, if Lincoln could have avoided it, history suggests he would have. But the bottom line was, he did the Emancipation Proclamation, which basically freed the slaves, okay? Now, he freed them in terms of there no longer being slaves, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people's attitudes suddenly changed overnight, that, oh, you black person that you were a slave, you're now going to be my best buddy, okay? So we went through a period called carpetbagging. I don't want to get into all of that, but what happened was, in the post-slavery era, black people began to leave the rural areas and the farms and the plantations where they had worked and started moving to the cities, southern cities for the most part. And the white people, or the European Americans, as I like to call them, within those cities began to get upset that all of these black people were moving into the neighborhood. Sound familiar, perhaps, to some of you. And as a result, they passed a series of laws which became known as the Jim Crow laws. Now, many of you may not have never heard of Jim Crow, but some of you might remember South Africa, when South Africa, right, was under white control, and South Africa had a system that was known as apartheid, which meant that there were separate facilities for all of the quote unquote races. In South Africa, they had three. There was black, colored, and white. In the United States, we basically had two. There was colored and there were white. And what that meant was separate toilets, separate restaurants, separate hospitals, separate hotels, separate schools, separate beaches. And you were best to stay within the particular area where you were supposed to be, unless otherwise there were dire consequences. The name Jim Crow comes from a character where this white actor, whose name I don't even want to mention, used to paint himself up with blackface and tour around the United States pretending to be black and making fun of black people. The character's name was Jim Crow, and for a while, this gentleman was extremely popular through much of the United States. His popularity faded away, but when the laws were put into place, somehow the whole notion of Jim Crow came back and the laws became known as Jim Crow laws. They were basically almost identical and equally as harsh as what was in place in South Africa under the apartheid days, just to give you a feel. So even though the Civil War ended slavery, it did not end discrimination against black people. In other words, the institution of racism, which had been slavery, now moved to another form of institutionalized racism, which became known as Jim Crow. And this was pretty much, I need to be kind of reductionist and short in the history here. And this was pretty much our life for quite some time, okay? And so you get through the early 1900s, early, 1920s, 1930s, you begin to actually see pockets of black prosperity in Oklahoma until that particular area was burned down by a white mob. In various other parts, in Philadelphia, in Harlem, in other parts, there were pockets where the black community was large enough for people to develop some economic substance of their own and not have to be so dependent upon the quote unquote European American side of the American society. I'm going to go a fast forward. We're going to go through the Civil Rights Act and Martin Luther King and all of these people who protested back in the 60s. And lo and behold, and I'm really being reductionist here, but you guys can read up on the history if you want and dig a little deeper. In 1964, we have the Equal Opportunity Act, which basically removed the concept of separate but equal and replaced it with, in theory, equal access for all. Okay. In other words, it was no longer legal to discriminate and not allow black people to stay in your hotel. Okay. This still happens in some parts of the United States. It happened to me recently in a small hotel in North Carolina where somebody refused to rent us a room, but that's another story. Okay. So this whole issue of Jim Crow is, again, deeply anchored in American society. And whether it's conscious or not, okay, people have evolved within the society, both black and white. And whether it's a question of perhaps privilege on one side or lack of privilege and access on the other side, this is just the reality of what has been going on, okay? Let me just quickly scroll. I see a whoop whoop for Harlem, okay? Thank you very much. So 1964, guess what? Yours truly can finally go into Disneyland because Walt Disney can no longer keep black people out of Disney World or Disneyland, which was what the case was back in those days, okay? And this is not that long ago. I mean, the 60s, well within my lifetime, even though it's, 50 years ago. So this is, something that's still very, very current, right? Now, and I'm going to kind of race forward. So after the 60s, we have a period of kind of feeling, wow, okay, Equal Opportunity Act. We had affirmative action, which were programs to try and facilitate the access of women and minorities, as we were called, right? To facilitate their access into jobs, which meant perhaps better jobs into corporations, better access into universities. For example, I was one of the first black students ever admitted into Middlebury College in Vermont, for example, back in the day. Suddenly doors were opening that hitherto had been closed. And there was a certain amount of euphoria that, hey, things are changing, we're moving ahead, progress is being made. And I think, generally speaking, while perhaps the train was not moving as quickly as we would have liked it to move, I think most of us would say that there was at least some movement, perhaps begrudgingly, clearly, but there was some movement of the train. This culminated, to some extent, this euphoria and hopefulness culminated in the election, and here I'm being very, very, very reductionist in terms of time and somewhat simplistic, perhaps culminated in the election of President Obama, okay, where a significant percentage of the vote, of particularly the European American vote, voted for Obama. And I think when that happened, there was also this notion of, okay, see, it's all over. You guys, quote, and this is what a lot of people were saying was, you guys have now got a black president, right? So therefore, there can't be racism anymore because there's a black president, as if there was somehow a direct correlation between the two, okay? And I think the United States was extremely hopeful of what might happen, and indeed what did happen over that 8-year period where things seemed to be relatively sane and whatever. And I think I even returned to the United States after a long absence in Switzerland in 2014, kind of on the heels of Obama, hoping to participate in this newly emerging, America and hopefully a changed black experience. Unfortunately, or fortunately, as some might say, depending on your political beliefs, Hillary did not win the election. Donald Trump won the election and spent a large part of the early days of his administration doing everything that he could to destroy everything that Obama had put into place. And at least that's what they were saying. In fact, there was a much deeper agenda with a lot of other activities. It didn't have anything to do with Obama, but that's not really the topic of our discussion here, okay? But the bottom line was the Trump administration clearly changed attitudes, one. Second, the language that the president began to use began to suggest to certain other members of the population who had hitherto perhaps gone underground because it was no longer politically correct to be racist, to now suddenly begin venting their anger and distrust and all of this, which had never actually disappeared. It had always been there, okay? And most Black people will grant that. We knew it hadn't disappeared, okay? I think many of us had hoped that, at least if I speak personally, I've been, over the last few months, personally extremely surprised by the number of white people that really just, European Americans again, that despise me simply because of my color. They don't even know me. They've never met me, but they already hate me, right? And in some cases are willing to shoot at people of my color that they don't even know for really strange circumstances. You guys have been following the news. I don't want to, drag you through all of the horrible things that we've seen, okay? So we now have a situation where, as I think the world saw, and I think what ignited the keg of dynamite, if you will, perhaps internationally speaking, was the death of George Floyd, okay, which has now become associated with BLM. But let's just talk about George Floyd. And Ferguson, okay? The death of George Floyd did not surprise any Black people at all, okay? Because actually, if you look, you'll discover that there's been a George Floyd almost every week, and in some cases, several times a week, in many different cities in the United States for quite some time. The only difference is, perhaps the key difference is that people didn't have cell phones and were unable to document what was going on. Now it's regularly documented. It's up on, it's on Snap, it's on Facebook, it's on TikTok, it's everywhere, okay? So the news and the word is, and what's going on is a lot more visible, okay? So this current friction that we're seeing is in fact not new, okay? What is happening is, to some extent, it could be argued that what the president has done is opened Pandora's box. Now, some would say, well, good, because at least now we can have a discussion about it. Yeah, but the discussion is resulting in people, in some cases innocent people, getting shot and killed, okay? So we need to be careful about that notion of opening Pandora's box. Now I see a quick question came in. Let me see that. Think that even with the electing of Obama has not ended the behavior among the American society. If imposes the Black racism again and again. Yeah. Yes. I think that comment is right on target. For those of you who perhaps had an opportunity to watch the debate between President Trump and Biden, at one moment, the moderator, who's from Fox, which is a conservative, normally pro-Trump network, asked President Trump to deny the fact that he was a supporter of white supremacists, asked him overtly, and the president refused to do so, okay? Basically, the word that has gone around is get ready, right? Stand back and stand ready, right? Ready for what? I mean, what is he talking about? Okay, so we see this, the president overtly encouraging, okay, white supremacists. Now, that notion of white supremacy leads me directly to BLM. Now, a couple of words about BLM. I'm a BLM supporter, okay? I give money to the organization, and when I can, I contribute time. I'm in the streets. I was recently one of the people at the 10,000 person demonstration here in Geneva. Why? Because I've been protesting against police brutality since I was 17 years old. My first march was in Washington, D.C. That's how much, to some extent, unfortunately, things have not changed. The Black Lives Matter movement was created after the death of Trayvon Martin, okay, who was shot by a gentleman called George Zimmerman. I mean, most of the Americans in the audience will know the story, but bottom line was this young man was shot under questionable circumstances. And as a result, the organization, which now calls itself, the movement, which now calls itself Black Lives Matter, was created. And it was created to to combat, if you will, two evils, if you will. Okay, I know that's a bad word. This is a Disney type word. Number one was police brutality, which is something that we in the Black community, we have a unique relationship with the police. And if we have time, although there isn't a whole lot left, that's maybe a whole topic for another talk. But traditionally, relationships between the police and the Black community have been, let's say, to put it mildly, have been strained. And as I mentioned to you, I was already in the streets in 1969 over police brutality, okay, in the Black community. Okay, so this has been going on for a long, 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 long time. The second issue is white supremacy, okay? We don't believe in white supremacy. We don't believe in Black supremacy. Indeed, we don't believe in anybody's supremacy, but we definitely don't believe in white supremacy. Now, what has happened is those two ideas, which are the core of the movement, and this is why I keep using the word movement. We're not an organization, okay? We don't have any structure. We're not like a corporation where there's lieutenants and right, all of this. Okay? It's just a loose gathering of people under the same banner. And as a result of that, we don't all believe exactly the same thing. We all believe that Black Lives Matter, but we have some crazies in the group. Yes, we do. No question about it. And they would look at me and say, you know, Bill, you're just not far enough out there on the front line. Okay. Now I see quickly, I'm going to try and respond. Isabel, yes. Brazil, you know, you're from Brazil, which is a country I absolutely love. I have a house in Salvador de Bahia, so I'm a little bit of a Baiano, and I've lived and worked in Salvador, so I have some experience, unfortunately, with the Brazilian police. And you're absolutely right, particularly when it comes to Black people. It's very clear that they're working under instructions. But if you think about it historically, right? It's an extension of the plantation mentality, because the Black people that came to Brazil, and there were, and let me give you a number, there were 4.5 million Africans landed in Salvador de Bahia during the same period that 800,000 Africans were landed in the United States, okay? So by far, the bulk went to Latin America or South America, which is where the bulk died. For years and years and years, Brazilians pretended that there was no such thing as racism, because there had been a lot of let's call it intermarriage and interaction, right? And so perhaps everybody has a little bit of this and everybody has a little bit of that. But the bottom line is, if one looks at the power structure in Brazil, it's very clear that it's white driven. It's Europeanized Brazilian driven. Okay, so yes, you know, your comment there is right on target. Is right on target. And I see Gail is talking about, you know, there are laws. Yes, there are. The thing, Gail, the thing that I've noticed, unfortunately, over my lifetime is that the law helps. It gives you recourse. But as we used to say back in the 60s, when we were fighting for the civil rights in the United States, you can't legislate morality, right? In other words, we can change the law, but that doesn't make you know, Joao not be a racist anymore. You know, it doesn't mean that Charlie from Georgia is not going to sneer at the Black people that he knows. Okay, so even though it's legal, that doesn't mean racism doesn't exist. Okay, so your point is very well taken. Is very well taken, and you're correct. You have a president. I mean, I shouldn't perhaps linger on politics too much. Whose politics, i.e., Mr. Bolsonaro's, whose politics are very similar to our President Trump's, for better or for worse. I'm not passing judgment here. I was not brought in here to reflect my own personal opinions. Yeah. Okay. Ismail mentions the issue of access to guns. Yeah, it's part of the issue, but it's a little bit of the sideline to the issue. You know why, Ismail? Because there's a lot of Black people who own guns as well. Okay. Indeed, in a lot of circles at the moment, Black gun ownership is being overtly encouraged. When you see a group of 20 or so European Americans dressed in military fatigues who walk into the Senate, okay, of the state of Michigan, dressed as if for war, and then barricade people out and nothing happens. You can just imagine had that been 20 black people dressed in black jeans and, dressed like Black Panthers with submachine guns, AR-15s, if they had done the same thing in front of the Michigan Senate building, you can imagine what would have happened. Right? So it's not so much the guns per se, and please don't misunderstand me. I'm not necessarily a pro-gun person. The gun issue in the United States is indeed a huge problem, but that's another problem. But yes, I mean, and the bottom line of what you're saying is, yes, you're absolutely right, Ismail. The police have guns and we don't, right? And anyone who's read Jared Diamond's infamous book, right? Guns, Germs, and Steel, which basically describes the if you will, the European or the white conquest of much of the world, which was not due to brain power, it was basically due to superior weapons, diseases, which killed a lot of the native population, and then steel, which allowed them to make things that people in the countries that they were conquering, quote unquote, or colonizing, did not have access to. Okay. So kind of hopefully that gives you some context of why BLM is still here. I'm in my 60s, you guys. I'm no longer a young person. And what strikes me, and the reason that I've kind of gotten so active again, and it was really at the suggestion of my daughter, who was basically, Daddy, I think you need to channel some of your frustration and largely frustration into something positive. And that's exactly what I've been doing. So within my professional career now, I've moving away from marketing and more into what we call DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I suddenly realized I've been working in for a long time, because my first job in General Motors years ago, when I was still in the corporate world, was actually helping to revitalize a large section of Detroit, which was in fact a corporate social responsibility outreach towards the African-American community, or towards the Black community. So these are issues, and I've been involved with for quite some time, for quite some time. Yeah, Isabel. Yeah, I hear you. I think everybody can, maybe you want to share that and change it to the panelists, not to the panelists, but open it up to everyone else. Is anybody, are there any questions? I know I've been kind of yakking at you guys. This has been, very much one way up until recently. Does any, oh my goodness, we have like, wow, 45 people here. Any questions about any of this? Maybe I'll add just a few more words towards the end here. It could be argued that any intelligent person of color living in the United States who isn't angry has got some neurons missing, right? And indeed, I have often said that African Americans are the most optimistic people in the world, if you think about it. Why do I say that? Because most of us wake up every morning, right, or go to bed every night thinking that tomorrow is going to be better than yesterday, but in our heart of hearts, knowing that unfortunately that's probably not going to be the case. But we nonetheless keep on pushing. Okay, now, the other perhaps positive note that I want to end on, as I mentioned, when there was George Floyd, but also in Ferguson. Ferguson was the one, remember when they had the white guys with the khaki pants and the torches and all of this kind of stuff, protesting for white supremacy and whatever. And when the protesters came out, I was really surprised, because the vast majority of the protesters were not Black. They were white, okay? And Hispanic, and Chinese American, and Vietnamese American, and Indian American. Okay, and I suddenly realized, at least my heart started beating a little bit, and on a positive note, that like, hey, wait a minute, these millennials, quote unquote, these Gen Z folks who who perhaps grew up thinking that there was no such thing as racism any longer, have now seen George Floyd die in front of their eyes. They've seen people get shot, right, in the back. And suddenly they're realizing, wait a minute, this shouldn't be happening. There's clearly a problem here. And it's going into the streets. And why is that important? Because the vast majority of the population of the United States is 61.7% white, to be precise. In other words, nothing can be accomplished without the support of a large segment of the European American community. And so when I see these young white folks, European Americans, whatever term you want, I see these young folks in the streets, I take heart. You know, these are people who are saying, you know, enough is enough, and we're going to change stuff. This might have been cool for your time, but it's definitely not cool for our time, and we're going to try and do something about it. Okay. Someone was asking whether there's any connection between the pandemic and the Floyd protests. To be honest, I don't think so, but you know, now that you mention it, it could have been that because so many people were now at home, right, who were not at work, that there were a lot of people who had an opportunity to vent their frustration and make their opinions known, who otherwise would have been working, who perhaps never would have been there, okay? So there might be an element of that indeed, Ismail. There might be an element of that, okay? But historically, I see a couple of questions, you know, about the police. Historically, the police in the Black communities have always had a little bit of a difficult time, and some attribute it, which is perhaps true and perhaps not 100% true, but that the origins of the official police force lay in the creation of the slave catchers back in the day, which until then it could be argued there was no organized quote unquote quote enforcement force. There would be an individual like a sheriff or whatever, and he would call upon people to help, right? A posse, as you've seen in the movies, right? And so it was very much, to some extent, a vigilante type of operation that worked very well, more or less well, right? But now, when the slaves began to escape, this is like cattle rustling, okay? And you get shot for cattle rustling, okay? So suddenly, a force of people is created whose job it is to go get those slaves and bring them back, because we're talking about, hey, my money just ran away from the bank. You better go find that bag of money and bring it back, okay? So this tension, again, is historical, okay? Some also draw an ethnic issue here, which I've often heard repeated, which is that many of the police forces in the particularly in the early days of the United States, particularly in the East Coast, were often Irish people. And indeed, many of the Irish folks who came across in the early days were indentured servants to the English. In other words, they were pretty much like white slaves themselves, and they were often put in charge of the Black people. In other words, many of the overseers of slaves were often Irish. Okay. And so, again, some could argue that there are historical antecedents, whether they're directly related or indirectly related, nonetheless were part of the reality at that particular time, and which could still be influencing people today. There's no question that there are, you know, infiltration of the police forces by the white supremacist organizations. This has been confirmed by the New York Times and others in recent months. So let me see. One person who thinks that, despite the fact that some movement are being created like Black lives, nothing will change. The question is, do you think that there will be another way to help change people's mindsets regarding racism about Black people? Leonid. Yeah, this is one of the reasons, Leonid, why I work for this organization called the Human Library, where I have the same type of discussion that I'm having with you folks, with executives of corporations. And so to date, I've worked with the IMF, the World Bank, Heineken, Masco, I mean, just to drop a few names along the way, along these same types of lines, because I think there's been a kind of a global wake-up call that we have to do something about this. Now, whether this will be long-term whether this awareness is cosmetic as a response to a George Floyd issue. I think on some levels, perhaps yes. 3 months ago, I was being bombarded by messages from various corporations whose products I buy telling me about what they were going to do for Black Lives Matter, this and that and the other thing. But when it actually comes down to substantive change, I'm, to be quite honest, I haven't seen a whole lot of that happening. Indeed, what I'm actually hearing from a lot of human resources people from large corporations, and I must have talked to maybe 20, 30 over the last few months here, is, Bill, what do we do? Bill, what do we do? Bill, what do we do? And I'm thinking to myself, you're the human resources director of a multi-billion-dollar company. You have thousands of people reporting to you, and you don't know what to do? When basically the issue is a very simple issue. It has to do with making sure that everyone is treated with an equal level of common humanity and decency. Whether they're white, black, green, LGBTQ, whatever. And for some reason, that very simple concept seems to be very hard to get some folks to understand. Okay. Now, a question here about, let's see, about reparations. Gail, boy, that's a question that is close to my heart. Already 15 years ago, I was invited to a government conference in Barbados, specifically on this issue. It has been around for a while and has been perhaps gathering a little more momentum, perhaps in recent years. When the Jews were able to get some reparations for what they had suffered during World War II, I think that kind of was a little bit of a wake-up call to a lot of Black people that, hey, maybe it's possible. At the risk of offending a lot of people here, I think if there were reparations to be requested, I think the place to start actually would be with the European royal families. And why do I say that? Is because many, if not most of the slavers were operating under royal charter. In other words, corporations were created that Isabella owned a piece of, or the Queen of England owned a piece of, and that money came back into their coffers. Indeed, Bristol in the UK is well known for the role that it played in the slave trade. The slave trade created many a merchant bank, created many a financial institution, which basically serviced what was at one time one of the most profitable businesses in the world. Okay? So yes. And how to decide the fund allocation, that's a really, really good question. I have some ideas of my own, which tend to go more along macro community development lines as opposed to individual payments, right? But that's something that, will need to be debated. First, we would have to get some recognition of the fact that reparations make sense. And that has been a long battle. And we're not, at the moment, I think it's safe to say we're not winning that particular fight. No, we're not. Generalizing of police authorities, another question that came in. Is it correct to say that every cop is like those we see on social media since they are acting underneath the same power? Or where do we draw the line? That's a very good question. I guess the question is, are there good cops and are there bad cops? And the answer is yes. There are definitely good cops and there are definitely bad cops. No question. Right? So we can't tar everyone with the same brush. Okay. However, I have someone who used to be a police officer in my family. However, what even the good cops face is a culture within the police that is, in some cases, extremely toxic. And it varies from city to city because each city has its own police force, its own police chief, right? So not just from state to state, but also from town to town, okay? So while, as a Black person, you might feel fine in New York City, you go to some little town in upstate New York and get stopped by a sheriff there late at night, chances are, the conversation might not be exactly the same. So we have both, like most countries. So no, not all the cops are bad cops. No, No, I don't believe that for a moment. The system is a large part of the problem because it encourages certain behaviors. The president will openly go to a police function and suggest that they're not treating the bad guys hard enough. That's literally what he told them, right? And so it's no surprise that suddenly people are getting shot and beaten up and choked to death. You know, why? Because, well, it could be argued the president said it was okay. So yes. Yeah, and I think I just answered, the HTC question. Do I think each state does have its own standards? Yes, and those standards are extremely different. Each state has its own laws, even. Okay, so something that can be permitted right next door, you cross the line and you can go to jail for a long time in some cases. Right? So yes, it's the nature of the structure of the different states within the United States, right? And this has its positive elements, and it has its negative elements. As someone who lives in Switzerland, we have 26 little cantons, which is like our little 26 states, and they have different laws and different tax levels and all of this kind of stuff. But it works somehow. We seem to hang together over here. What has happened in the U.S. is we've been driven apart. The current president has done a very effective job of dividing us, and it's your classic strategic move of divide and conquer, right? So there's really nothing new or surprising here, and he has been ruthlessly effective in terms of how he has accomplished that. Absolutely. Okay, Hans. Yeah, should the news wait for the facts to come up instead of jumping on to conclusion and pushing a narrative that could be wrong and furthering the division? Okay, that's a very interesting question. But I think there's perhaps, Hans, a fundamental misunderstanding there, which is in the United States, the purpose of the media is not to inform you. That has never been its job. Its job is to make money for the people who own the station. And so what they will show is what people want to see. There's no surprise that when you turn the news on, no matter where you go, it's always bad news. There's no good news channel, whether in Europe or in the United States or wherever. Okay, hearing bad news makes us feel better, right? That didn't happen to me. Oh my goodness, I actually had a day that was okay. Okay, so your question kind of presupposes that the purpose of the media is to inform us, and that is not its purpose. May I suggest a book called Propaganda by a gentleman called Edward Bernays? Okay, Propaganda by Edward Bernays, that was written in 1928, which basically says that when you have a democracy where a large number of the population is uneducated, that unless you have someone help them make their decisions, you're going to get a lot of stupid decisions. And some would say that's what we're seeing in the United States. So Bernays said, well, you need people to help them think, to help them, to influence them. Okay, and that's the true role of the media. Okay, the role of the media is to condition your thinking, my friend. And that's why people like, Berlusconi in Italy owned so many TV stations and newspapers. Okay, that's why Rupert Murdoch and the others. Okay, so do I think and another thing, if I may, is that in recent years the news is no longer the news. What we get is opinion, and this is in this you're absolutely right, Hans. What we get, particularly on the American channels, and here in Switzerland, I'm an avid news follower, so I watch I watch BBC. I watch CNN, but I also watch I-24, the Israeli news. I watch JTV, the Japanese channel. I watch CCTV, the Chinese channel. Why? My dad taught me this. He says, my dad would say to me, Billy, they're all liars. He says, but if you listen to the story, if you listen to them all tell, there's going to be some grain of commonality, and somewhere in there probably lies the truth. And there's a lot of truth in that, because you hear the US cover a story, and then you watch the German media cover the story, and then you listen to the Israeli media cover the story, and you get three completely, totally different points of view on exactly the same issue. So don't give me a point of view, just give me the news. And Hans, I couldn't agree with you more, but unfortunately, these are businesses whose job it is to make money. And if sensationalizing things makes you money, which it seems to in many cases, that's where they're going to go. So it shouldn't come as any surprise. Okay. The BLM movement, including the demonstration drawing awareness to a problem which is long overdue. That's absolutely correct. But what about destroying private property while demonstrating is a good cause? Okay, that's a very good question. Firat, you're absolutely right. There is no need for the destruction, one could argue. However, I don't want to justify it, so please listen carefully to my words. The only time that we've ever seen effective change happen that concerned people in the Black community is in most cases when we rioted in our community, and we burned our own houses down. Now, that might sound completely futile, and it is completely futile. But what it does is it draws attention to the cause. Okay? And if you don't have any resources to work with, you use whatever you have, and at the risk of perhaps offending some folks here, and I don't mean to, kind of the reaction of what we've seen sometimes from certain Palestinians in Palestine is kind of a similar reaction. Okay. When you're powerless, there's always going to be some type of compensatory mechanism, always. For every, as you learn in physics, right? You guys all went to school. You're still in school, right? For every action, there is a reaction. Right? So, yeah, social media is a comment there, as you guys can see. Social media has done a good job, I think, of opening people's eyes and making us aware of what's out there. Unfortunately, as someone who works in marketing and been in marketing, I know what can be accomplished using social media, and it is as easy to provide disinformation as it is information. And as a result of that, there's tons of content out there now that is completely fallacious, okay, false, which some people absolutely believe and will swear by. Okay, so social media is a two-edged sword. I'm not condemning it at all. I mean, in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that has to do with racism and discrimination, social media has given people a platform to share what's going on with the rest of the world. And that has been very positive. Okay, getting back to the destruction thing, there is no excuse for that. But again, there's a lot of pent-up anger and frustration. Okay, this has been going on, you guys, and oh my goodness, the clock is ticking. As usual, I'm running past time. Let me say this one more time, you guys. I'm in my 60s. Okay, I went to my first protest against this type of behavior when I was 17 years old. I went to my last protest about 3 months ago here in Geneva, and unfortunately, not a whole lot has changed. And so when you're faced with a situation like that, I mean, if you're someone perhaps with me, reasonably, middle class, reasonably well educated, I don't go around smashing stuff. I can afford to buy my stuff. But suddenly those $200 pair of Nikes that I always wanted, that I know I'm not going to be able to afford, and I'm really pissed off. And yeah, I'll smash the window and take the shoes. Yeah, they might. I get it. I don't condone it, but I get it. Folks, boy, oh boy, oh boy, a whole slew of questions here. I've got to go. Unfortunately, I've already stayed well beyond my welcome. So I would just like to thank all of you for having participated. You know, the questions I think have enabled you guys to share some ideas amongst each other, which I think is equally important to hopefully some of the ideas that I've had an opportunity to share with you. So on that note, may I ask you all to stay positive and perhaps more importantly, stay safe, right? Like we say back in New York, the Rona's still running around. So, you know, y'all need to make sure you run a little bit faster than the Rona does, okay? Just to make sure that you stay safe and stay masked. If you're ever in the Dubai campus, I teach most of my Hult classes at the Dubai campus. And so I'll look forward to seeing some of you. Until then, please be well, be safe. And thank you very much for the opportunity to have this conversation with you guys.
Thank you so much, Bill. Bill, I think that was just excellent. I think especially as somebody who does a lot of these Zoom webinars, it can be very difficult. Sometimes it can feel very stale that it's one way. And I felt like this was a true conversation and super informative. I think it was really, really good. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for getting involved. We definitely couldn't have done it without you. As we said before, a recording of this webinar will be sent out in the coming days. And if anybody is also interested in any more of our webinars to celebrate UK Black History Month, our next one is on the 14th of October with Professor Daniel Rukare, who's looking at insights from Africa, the investment opportunities. If you want to register for that, please see hult.edu/virtual skills. So that's all from us today. Thank you again, Bill, and thank you everybody for joining us.